Hi, I'm Susan, and this is Susan Stanley Stitch in Time. And on today's episode, I'm going to be sharing the next chapter in the First Stitches doll quilt story and project series. And if you're not a part of that, I hope you'll look at some of the other episodes and take a peek at my website, because I'd love you to join along on the journey as well. This little girl that we're talking about today is Pharaby, and she lives in Boyette, Kentucky. And on last episode, that was in December, Pharaby was celebrating the solstice with her family. They had gone out into the forest to get a tree to bring home to set up for and celebrate Yule. And so what I'm trying to do by sharing this with you is help you experience the material culture and life that was going on when these doll quilts, these antique items were being made, when these marking samplers were being stitched, when doll quilts were being made, and how children learned to sew in the 19th century. So our time this year is 1870, and our place for this little girl is Boyette, Kentucky. And I've been telling so much of the story that my own journal book that I've been creating with each chapter it's almost full, and I've ordered another one, so I'm ready to move on to the next one. And I know many of you want to start a journal. I hope you have, and many of you want the chapters that I've written out. I'm trying to figure out a way to do that. You know, in the meantime, you can write notes, gather ephemera and things like that. And I hope you'll create your own version of the story, maybe with your experience making the doll quilt or stitching the marking sampler or anything that we've done in line with the material culture of the 1870s. Now, last time we talked about paper dolls, and so of course the story is going to include some elements about paper dolls, and more is coming on paper dolls because you were all very excited about that, and so I'm happy to share with you some of the things that I've learned and how I made them. But let's take a look at chapter 19, Pharaby and the Paper Dolls. And I hope you have some stitching, and I'm going to read to you. And this is the next step in the journey of Pharaby in her first stitches experience. Pharaby woke up much earlier than usual. There was just a small crack of light in the winter sky as she dressed for the day. She was buzzing with excitement as she put on her warm layers of clothing. Today was a special Sunday at church. A traveling Methodist minister would be preaching, and the whole town was likely to attend the service. The last time they had a traveling minister was early November, when a Baptist preacher came. The last month since Christmas had been long and cold and lonely. They had an ice storm which had made long icicles on the eaves of the house at the beginning of January. It was only a bit warmer now, and she was looking forward to seeing some of the children from school and meeting new visitors who would be coming from local towns for the event. Mother had spent much of Saturday preparing food to be shared with the congregation after the church service had ended. Pharaby helped stir the simmering pots when asked and kept the wood box full next to the stove, while Althea watched from her perch in a chair next to the table. When Mother made some cookies sprinkled with cinnamon, Pharaby helped cut them out and carefully place them on a tin sheet before they were placed in the oven. The rich, spicy smell lingered in the cold air and mixed with the odor of the freshly brewing coffee. The familiar sound of the two mules, Sadie and Sam, making their odd whinnying and braying noises, along with the clank and rumble of the wagon, could be heard throughout the house as Father brought them around to the side entrance. In the kitchen, Mother was dishing up warm porridge along with slices of ham and beans from the night before. Steaming cups of coffee were already set out, and Father was warming his hands by the stove. "It will be a cold ride into town," he said. "You best get your heavy coat for the journey. We'll be stopping to pick up Widow Jenkins, so I've put some extra covers on the bench in the back." Pharaby liked Mrs. Jenkins, who was their nearest neighbor and lived alone on her farm now. She had taught Pharaby how to knit and had always been so kind. As soon as the family had eaten, Pharaby cleared the table and tidied up the kitchen while Mother finished getting ready for the day. The covered food for the afternoon supper had been carefully packed into a basket lined with toweling. Pharaby could smell the hearty scent of the salted pork Father had prepared late last summer and the vegetables from Mother's prized canned goods. All of these had gone into the burgoo stew, and Pharaby wondered what other things would be served. She knew there would be plenty of biscuits and cornbread, and she hoped Mrs. Miller would bring her honey butter. When Mother appeared in the kitchen, she was wearing her best dress, her wool shawl, and a wool hat, and holding her Bible. Pharaby thought she looked beautiful. "Gather up the rest of the buggy quilts and blankets," she said to Pharaby as she put on her gloves and grabbed her muff. "Father is waiting outside. Althea will need to stay at home." Pharaby quickly wrapped her doll in her new quilt and placed her in the sitting room chair. The room was being kept warm by a fire, and she felt happy about leaving her there. The ride was indeed cold, but the anticipation of the gathering kept Pharaby from thinking about the frosty feeling in her toes. Nobody said a word as the mules pulled the wagon that bounced and rocked over the still frozen road to Mrs. Jenkins' house. Mrs. Jenkins was waiting by her back door with her basket of food, a basket of mending she had done for some bachelor farmers in the neighborhood. She had done in trade for some produce, and her satchel. Father jumped down off the wagon and helped her up onto the seat next to Pharaby, and then placed her baskets behind them. After Mrs. Jenkins was settled, she reached into her satchel and pulled out her knitting. As the wagon turned onto the road, she asked Pharaby if she wanted to sing some hymns, and Pharaby nodded. The two of them began to sing, and Mother hummed along as Mrs. Jenkins knit on her wool muffler for the remainder of the ride, her knitting needles tapping to the beat of the songs. Pharaby secretly hoped she would be able to knit without looking at her hands someday like Mrs. Jenkins. There was a bustle of activity once they arrived at the meeting house. Families were unloading baskets of food to be shared while the men took the wagons to water mules and tie them up. Warm food was placed on the wood stove. It would be several hours before the mules would be called upon to return families to their homes. Mother and Father were talking to neighboring farmers about hopes for the spring and new crops. "Come here, Pharaby," said Mother. "Mrs. Miller has something for us." Pharaby quickly joined Mother and listened as Mrs. Miller explained her gift. "I would like to pass on my newest Godey's Ladies magazine to you," she said. "I have enjoyed the articles and information, and I believe you will too. There is something in the middle section I think you will especially like, Pharaby. As you know, I have 3 boys, and they are not too interested." Mother and Pharaby both thanked Mrs. Miller as she went to separate her 2 younger boys who were in a tussle. Mother quickly opened the pages. Printed in the center of the magazine were 2 paper dolls with the most elegant clothes Pharaby had ever seen. "We'll save this for now," said Mother as the meeting was about to start. Pharaby had a hard time paying attention to the visiting preacher, even though he spoke in a loud voice so everyone could hear. She wished the singing would end so she could get back home to enjoy the new gift. She imagined herself wearing one of the dresses she'd seen in the magazine. The service ended and the congregation gathered for the meal. Long boards had been set out in the same room and everyone helped rearrange the chairs while the ladies spread the food along the edges. Baskets containing dishes rattled as they were unloaded and the room was full of laughter. People were visiting while children threaded through the groups and occasionally got into mischief. There was more than enough food for everyone, and Pharaby ate until she felt like she would burst. After they were done, Father gathered the mules and the wagon, and Mother and Mrs. Jenkins helped clean up the room. Warm wishes were shared as the townsfolk began to head home. Pharaby was snuggled deep down under the blankets, waiting to go, when Mother lifted the corner. "You might enjoy this on the ride back," she said, while she handed her the magazine. "Thank you, Mother," she squealed. She carefully opened it to the center where the paper dolls were printed. She took in each detail, running her fingers along the edge of each dress. She admired the prints and wondered if she would ever own any of these dresses. Some of the fabrics were things she had never seen before. As soon as Mrs. Jenkins was seated on the bench next to her and knitting again, Pharaby put the magazine away for later. She listened as the adults passed along comments about the sermon and neighborhood news, while the wagon rumbled along, taking them home. It was early evening before Mother was able to retire to the sitting room to help Pharaby with the paper dolls. On the side table lay the box from the hallway that contained the homemade paper dolls Pharaby had played with in the past, and a pair of paper shears. Many of the paper dolls were from Mother's childhood and were worn and weathered, but Pharaby loved looking at them in spite of their condition. "I'll cut out the new dolls, Pharaby, while you set up the ones in the box," said Mother. Mother had watched her daughter set up scenes before. The fancy dresses were lined up on the window ledge. The dolls each had a different corner of the room. Tiny chipped buttons became imaginary dishes and food items. Fabric scraps, or cabbage, as Mother called it, became blankets and beds. As soon as Mother had cut out a new doll or dress, Pharaby placed it in Althea's lap. Pharaby moved about the room as the sound of the long cylinder blades made a snip, snip, snip noise. Mother was lost in the memories she had from her own childhood and the times she and her sister played with paper dolls while she carefully cut. "I think it's in time we invited a few neighbors over for tea," said Mother. "It might be fun for you to share these with a friend, and perhaps we can find enough paper for you both to make a few of your own." "I would like that very much," said Pharaby. Although she hadn't really heard what Mother said, she was caught up in the imaginary world she had created on a winter afternoon in a room of a farmhouse in a small town called Boyette, Kentucky. So thank you for joining me for this next chapter in Pharaby's story. And next time, we're going to take a look at how I made my paper dolls that I shared with you in an earlier episode. So many of you loved them and wanted to make a set for yourself, so I'm going to share that with you. And until then, I hope you will make time for stitching and whatever else makes your heart happy. And I will see you soon.